If you're watching this video, then I can assume that just like me, you have also been playing a whole lot of Tears of the Kingdom. And after around 50 hours of playtime, I have beaten the game and can wholeheartedly conclude that I like Breath of the Wild better. Of course, it's important to make it clear that I actually did really like the game. I had a lot of fun, regardless of any performance issues, and we will get to those performance issues. Just like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom is an incredibly immersive game that is going to go down as one of the best Nintendo titles, one of the best Zelda games, and one of the greatest games of all time. And it definitely deserves those accolades, and I wish I could give every single person who worked to make this game a big ol' hug for their incredible work. However, as you can probably assume by the title and thumbnail, there is a lot I want to say about this game. I completed Breath of the Wild to 100% completion twice over, but I don't plan on ever doing a second playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom, and I don't even know if I want to get all the shrines. The game is extremely flawed, taking many aspects of Breath of the Wild and sidetracking it with a more modern Zelda approach, as well as just being a sequel to an already existing Zelda game and world. The game does some fantastic things and has some wonderful ideas that I hope are incorporated into any future Zelda title, and especially whatever they create next in this newly birthed open world Zelda series. And yet, on the flip of a coin, I hope to God that Nintendo forgets Tears of the Kingdom and once again goes back to re-examine why Breath of the Wild worked so well. As you can probably tell, there's a lot to unpack here, so get cozy and hold off on that angry comment, because what I'm saying is simply my perspective, and I would love to hear yours too, but I'd like to keep this discussion healthy. Alright, now with that out of the way, let's talk about intros. There is no denying that Breath of the Wild had an incredible introduction to a very special world and game. You wake up in the Cave of Resurrection, grab an iPhone, then have one of the biggest wow moments in gaming as it ramps up the music to introduce the world at large. From the onset, you are shown this wide open world to explore. Loads of key points of interest, from a castle to a mountain of flames, and of course, the sprawling open plains below. Then, we are given the plateau itself. The whole of the plateau is a tutorial for the wider game at large, but utilizes itself to teach players how to think about the world in the form of many different scenarios. Enemy encounters, world-based puzzle solving, environmental differences, and of course, shrines. The goal of the plateau is to get new players from thinking in the old formulaic Zelda style to this new open world approach, while still staying by their side when they need some help. This mostly hands-off style of teaching ends up playing into Breath of the Wild's strengths really well, and while a new player might not find out every single piece of information they can learn during the plateau, the game incentivizes discovery and learning through its structure that losing the teacher afterward isn't a detriment. Last but not least, after you finish the plateau, you are given the quest to simply destroy Ganon, as well as seek out Impa. Any player familiar with Zelda will know that Ganon is the big bad, giving them the hint that they could test their mettle now, or they could follow the other quest and try and explore the world to grow stronger beforehand. This contextualizes the entire explorative experience as progression towards destroying Ganon. Keep this in mind for later. Tears of the Kingdom, as the sequel, expects you to have played Breath prior, so the moment you boot the game, it launches you right into the game. No title screen, no options menu, nothing. I can appreciate it as it not only immediately defines the kind of story and journey we'll be having this time around, but also plays double duty as a way to give an impromptu tutorial to new players on how to play the game. Admittedly, I have a few gripes with this, but later. After some funny shenanigans, broken Master Sword, Zelda death, then Link death, we wake up with a new arm and voices in our head. The cave ahead teaches us about diving and how water can break falls before finally hitting us with that remarkable Breath of the Wild moment for the title drop. We dive off from a large height and see the sprawling, untouched skies as we fly down towards the next part of this Great Sky Island. Much like the Great Plateau, the Great Sky Island is trying its hardest to teach you how to play the game and how to think about the world at large before even letting you touch most of it. However, something to note right off the bat is that the Great Sky Island is much more linear than the Great Plateau. From traversal to encounters, everything is pretty much done in a straight, linear line. Of course, there are tiny offshoots here and and there, but most of the progression is straightforward. Compared to Breath's very hands-off approach to tutorials and teaching, this time around for new players, they crammed a lot of tutorial robots to teach you base mechanics and ideas like cooking or throwing weapons. And I'm fine with this, of course, but I still feel like it could have been done a bit more diegetically. Anyway, story shit occurs and we are told that we need to regather the powers of our new arm from the new shrines. Cool! I didn't touch on the Breath of the Wild abilities as they aren't necessities for the Great Plateau, but in comparison, the new abilities in tiers are required and taught to the best ability during the Great Sky Island. Our first ability is Ultra Hand, the flagship ability and the main selling point of tiers. It allows you to take nearly any object, move them around, and stick them together with other objects. This allows for a very nuts and bolts style approach to puzzle solving, and I dig it. The shrine we get it in teaches the core fundamentals of attaching objects to make pathways, removing objects from others, and then creating devices to traverse in unique ways. The last idea is the most important thing that it teaches you, as it becomes the way you traverse the Sky Island. The puzzle solving of the island changes from simply moving forward and slowly learning to forced exploration of your new ability to craft methods of transportation, from a minecart with a fan, to a boat, to a zipline type of thing. We use these methods to traverse and reach the second ability, Fuse. Fuse is a much simpler yet still wildly transformative ability. It allows the player to take weapons or items they have and attach them to other weapons and items. If you see a rock, attach it to a stick and suddenly you have an axe. The damage of the weapon goes up, and in some cases it can even reset the durability of the weapon. Thus, it makes the weapons and items you find infinitely more valuable, and works to fix players not making use of the stuff they pick up. A very good addition. The third ability we are given is the even simpler yet even more powerful Ascend. Ascend does what it says. It ascends us. If there is a ceiling above, you can go right through. For a game with as much verticality as Tears of the Kingdom, this ability is both a boon and a curse. A boon because you can save a lot of time that would have gone towards climbing or other solutions, but a curse because you very quickly realize that a lot of puzzles and ideas in the game that are presented to you are simply suggestions. But I digress. And the last ability is Rewind. Arguably the simplest ability and also the one you'll end up using the least. It can do a wide variety of things, some really cool, but compared to the others, it feels a little lackluster. It does what it says, rewinds things backward in time. This means their position and rotation will go back, I don't know, like 10-15 seconds or so. The time frame doesn't matter, as you only end up using it for one reason, which is to go upwards. Finally, the Great Sky Island ends with us losing the Master Sword, some clever foreshadowing, and finally opening up the clowns to tell us to jump the hell down to the rest of Hyrule. Like Breath, Tears has the main objective of find Princess Zelda, but also has the secondary objective of basically just exploring Hyrule. At least at first, but I'll save that for later. So, two great openings, but which do I prefer? Well, it's complicated. The world traversal present on the GSI is genuinely super engaging, as it gives the player opportunities to learn the ins and outs of Ultra Hand while also having some fun as hell puzzle solving moments. But it's extremely hand-holdy, and for an open world game, it does not offer a proper showcase of all the core gameplay tenets at play. Meanwhile, the Great Plateau with its hands-off approach chooses to let the player learn what they want and explore where they want, giving them a more accurate snippet of the regular game experience. In the end, both openings have their strengths, and I think both are great at showcasing what their respective game has to offer from both a micro and macro lens of their game's design and philosophy. Okay, so where does this all lead us? And more importantly, why is any of this important? Well, as I said, these tutorials offer us a look at what the games intend to offer us as players on a smaller scale. This in turn allows us to very quickly understand how the game wants us to play it, how it is designed, and most importantly, what it believes to be the most important aspect of itself. For Breath of the Wild, its most important aspect is without a doubt its free-form exploration. In Tears of the Kingdom, it's a more familiar linear structure, not unlike a more normal Zelda title, but in the world of Breath of the Wild. And these core philosophies will only hold true as we discuss what is perhaps the most important aspect of these games: the open world, exploration, and of course, discovery. I think it's pretty obvious that Breath of the Wild means a lot to so many people, and that is for a lot of different reasons. But talk to anyone who loves Breath of the Wild and you will see a pattern for sure. The main draw is a Zelda game with all that entails, but in an open world setting. And the biggest draw in a Zelda game is exploration and discovery. These two facets of Zelda are perhaps the most important when it came time to design an open world title. Exploration is the act of moving around the world at large. This usually involves seeing something and a little part of the brain thinking, go do that, and then just going to do it. And usually during exploration comes discovery. Finding new items, solving puzzles, marching on your own path, and doing things all on your own. The exploration and discovery in Zelda games is simply unmatched, and it shows. From Zelda 1 to A Link to the Past, some Wind Wakers and an Ocarina or two, and of course Breath of the Wild. But what the open world Zelda games have over their predecessors, barring Zelda 1, is the purest form of exploration and discovery. From the moment your shoes touch the earth below the Great Plateau, you are given immediate access to a wide world to explore and basically told nothing other than go. So, the first thing anyone will do is look to a place that seems cool and then just start walking. Along the way, they will fight enemies, collect items, see cool places, and more than likely pivot off into other directions because they see other cooler places they want to go. And the most important part, you never feel like any of your explorative efforts are wasted as they all serve the greater goal of getting you stronger so you can defeat Ganon. Simple as that. This keeps the player in an unconscious exploration frenzy, as the act of doing and seeing stuff is just so fun. Breath of the Wild, of course, continues trying to reward and keep players exploring through shrines and Korok seeds, the main vertical progression of the game, while forcing players to find better weapons, shields, and bows as a sort of horizontal progression due to the durability system. Both of these are extremely well executed and give a very rich and fulfilling gameplay loop of exploring, fighting, doing puzzles, and just plain old discovery. Now, what the hell does any of this have to do with Tears of the Kingdom? Well, quite a lot actually. The most important aspect of both open world design and Zelda as a whole is exploration. But Tears of the Kingdom has a mostly unchanged world map from Breath of the Wild. This point was brought up a lot prior to the game's release, as many touted that the game was just going to be a bigger DLC for Breath of the Wild, and while that is undoubtedly wrong, the reasoning isn't. The main chunk of explorative territory here in Tears of the Kingdom remains nearly unchanged from Breath of the Wild. This is bad for several reasons, but the most important is very obvious. You aren't really discovering nearly as much of the world because it's the second round. Of course, there are still things to discover and find and explore, like the new Sky Islands and of course the depths, but both of those have some pretty major issues that I want to touch on. But before that, the overworld. My main argument is that because of the layout of the world and story structure, a veteran Breath player will want to skip over any exploration because it ends up feeling very samey even when it's not. And it doesn't help that skipping over that exploration is so easy. The moment you have access to a tower, any tower, you will almost never ever explore from the ground again. You can simply send yourself sky high and mark every single point of interest from the air and then just glide on over to wherever you need to go. You can argue that the towers were bad in Breath 2, and that's true, they were, but you cannot argue that the towers in Tears aren't genuinely awful for both the player and the game. The universal truth of gamers is that the moment they find an easy way out, they will take it, even if it stops them from having fun. Every single time. And unfortunately, the towers in Tears are such an easy out. I know the world from Breath, so I pretty much know where to go, and now I have a tower that will make getting there easy and quick, so why would I spend the time traversing the ground? Well, the only incentive there is to utilize the Ultra Hand ability because it's new and flashy and cool, but it's also flawed. The main draw of building your own structures and vehicles is that it is just fun to do, but then you are punished for using them because they require Zonai parts and battery power. Battery power is the #1 incentive to avoid using Ultra Hand because everything you will make will just power off after like a minute. You can upgrade the battery, but I'll be damned if that will ever happen during the main game. And worse yet, even if it does get upgraded, it isn't by much. So, with no ground traversal occurring and the exploration cut from the overworld due to similarities with Breath, can't we at least have a good amount of fun in the skies and depths? Unfortunately, only partially. First up is the skies, or Sky Islands. The only real way to get up to most of them is via being shot into the air by the towers, but then a handful can then only be accessed by puzzle solving between the islands themselves. It's cool to utilize the Zonai parts to access new islands, as it gives a real dynamic environment puzzle feel kind of similar to many of Breath of the Wild's areas, except with a lot less charm. Many of the islands are extremely barren, even downright useless to explore, and once you realize that the floating platform can be infinitely cycled upward with fans, there is zero reason to check out nearly any of them at all. Because once again, it all comes back to being able to fly anywhere you want to go without a single care in the world. And the depths. Oh, don't get me started. At first, I thought the depths were an extremely cool concept, and to be fair, they are on the surface. An interconnected underground with tons of exploration and new discoveries waiting to occur, while also balancing a new light source system of blight bloom seeds that you throw which glow a specific area surrounding them. It seemed extremely cool. Then you find your first light route, and it lights up an entire portion of the underground, gaining you that piece of the map, and you'll never have to use bright blooms in that portion again. Then you find your second light route, and the lights connect together, and wow, holy, that is really cool. Now my goal is to uncover the entire underground and see everything. Yippee! To prepare, you pan up to the overworld to teleport to a shrine near another depths entrance, and then it clicks. Every single light route is connected to a shrine. Every single one. They had the chance. They really did. The depths could have been cool to explore, but knowing where every single light route is makes exploring really unenjoyable. And worse yet, if you find a light route connecting to a shrine you haven't found, then you just found a hidden shrine that could have allowed for a cool exploration moment. And it doesn't help that the depths is completely flat in terms of architecture and design. It's the same colors everywhere, and there is almost zero verticality to speak of. You walk and walk and walk, light a light, walk some more. It feels like I'm in Lord of the Rings if Frodo was completely fucking blind and Sam had to hold his hand every goddamn step. And yet, this isn't the worst part of the depths. The worst part is that every major location of the depths, save for 2, are just major locations of the overworld. Meaning, yet again, you really don't need to explore. So yeah, Tears of the Kingdom isn't a game about exploring, but we knew that going in from the Great Sky Island anyway, because as I said, this game is a linear Zelda title in Breath of the Wild's map. Now, if Tears of the Kingdom isn't supposed to be about exploring, then what is it supposed to be about? Well, the story is actually the main driving point for the game, and the story is exactly why this game is a linear Zelda title. As anyone who has played a Zelda game would know, the story is rarely the focus. The stories aren't necessarily bad, but they are never all that complicated or interesting. Breath of the Wild is a perfect example of the typical Zelda storyline. Your goal from the get-go is to defeat Ganon and save Zelda. The specific divine beasts and the associated characters and stories are entirely superfluous and add very little to the story to make it any more interesting. Beyond them, you could also grab all the memories that give greater context to the divine beasts and the relations between characters, but those add very little to the plot in any way. In contrast to Breath's lackluster and non-existent story, Tears of the Kingdom attempts to tell a much greater and grander tale with far more interesting characters, time travel, and of course Ganondorf, baby! The game also has memories that end up telling far more about the story than Breath's does. To give a brief plot synopsis for those who don't know or care, at the beginning of the game, the Demon King Ganondorf reawakens from his 1,000-year slumber or whatever, Zelda gets transported into the past, and the Master Sword ends up getting sent over to the past as well. Zelda becomes friends with the first king of Hyrule, Rauru, and learns about Zonai technology and the like. Eventually, though, Ganondorf beats Rauru and the sages exactly how Zelda remembered, and Zelda is left with the decision to turn herself into a sacred dragon to restore the broken Master Sword to become a weapon that can beat Ganondorf. Thus, the memories we find throughout the game are contextualized as Zelda's tears. The game ends with Zelda being turned back into her original form via the power of Rauru and Sonia, who are dead by the way, through Link. What a happy ending. This more story-focused design ends up hurting the freedom-focused world design that Breath of the Wild had. Breath of the Wild's story worked because the story was still very loose no matter where you went. You could solve any specific region's problems first, or not at all, and you would get the same or similar experience of the story. In comparison, Tears of the Kingdom has an extremely linear storyline. From the moment you touch Hyrule, you're told to go to a specific point, and then from there are told to go to another specific point. The game technically technically says you can go to any of the regions and solve them in whatever order you choose, but that isn't necessarily accurate. You are actively encouraged to pursue the Rito first, followed by Gorons, Zora, and ending with Gerudo. This order is pushed heavily with enemy levels and the overall damage they deal. Following this order will make the game structure very obvious, but it also reveals a large flaw, which is that it contradicts the order designated in Breath of the Wild. In Breath, there wasn't a clear-cut order, but you were lightly pushed into a Zora, Rito, Goron, Gerudo order. If you follow this order in Tears of the Kingdom, you are severely punished, and I don't say that lightly. Going to an area before you're supposed to in Tears results in many one-shot deaths. Enemies are designed to hit extremely hard this time around, so the only way around it is by getting more hearts and more armor. But if you follow the main order, things are almost always too easy in comparison. There is zero balance due to this story-based structure, and it only gets in the way more because it disincentivizes exploration. In Breath, every piece of exploration serves the goal of trying to beat Ganon. In Tears, everything you do does not make it any easier or harder to beat Ganondorf, or at the very least, not by much. But you are required to do all of the regions prior to even getting the chance to fight the final boss. This brings players out of the subconscious exploration flow state that having the clear-cut, permanently present goal gives. Instead, your goal is just to finish one region, then the next, until you are rewarded with the ability to care about Ganondorf. Why should I explore if I can't even fight Ganondorf? The game never really gives you a good reason, even with the greater attempt at a story. And if you never get all the memories to learn that Zelda is a dragon, then the incentive never comes. Without the story, what is the main selling point of Tears of the Kingdom? Well, that would have to be the dungeons. Dungeons are a staple of the Zelda series, requiring good puzzle-solving skills and combat prowess against the many tough bosses. Each dungeon in a Zelda game is usually themed around a specific idea or concept to which it ties its identity and puzzles to. Famous examples from Ocarina of Time include the Forest Temple and the Water Temple. Breath of the Wild also tried to follow this concept with the Divine Beasts, but the bosses and dungeons themselves were extremely bland and felt all the same. Even though each dungeon and boss was technically themed around the area and had a specific concept, they all had the same texture. However, in Tears of the Kingdom, we got proper dungeons in the form of the Wind, Water, Fire, and Thunder temples. The temples have a lot better theming and bosses, but the overall puzzles range from passable to downright awful. But that doesn't just apply to the puzzles. It also applies to the whole of the dungeons in the game and the accompanying bosses. Even though the dungeons in Tears are a whole lot better than Breath, they aren't actually very good compared to any modern Zelda title. Starting with the Wind Temple, which is the first we go for. It has an incredible build-up to the temple itself, and then we are given an extremely large wind-based ship to explore and solve. Most of the puzzles aren't all that incredible, but they at the very least require you to utilize all of your abilities in a few different ways across the temple. Even though the puzzles don't require much thought and are extremely simple, I can chalk that up to wanting new players to understand how a temple is supposed to be designed. Or at least I would, but the other temples go against this ideology. The boss of the Wind Temple is actually pretty good, even if it is extremely easy. You are forced into an aerial fight against this ice dragon thing with obvious weak points and even more obvious patterns. But easy doesn't mean bad, and this boss exemplifies the common Zelda boss fight design in a great way. As a first dungeon, the Wind Temple does a pretty good job getting the player up to speed in the open world environment. The next temple is the Fire Temple, and holy god is it awful! The entirety of this dungeon can be skipped with zero thought. You just climb walls and break a couple walls. It is unequivocally the worst dungeon, and that is not arguable in any way. If I wanted to break puzzles, I would go play the shrines. The boss is fine, but it's pretty frustrating due to having to constantly run towards Goron bro and hit A and shoot him. Moving on to the next dungeon, the Water Temple. And God, is the Water Temple disappointing. The lead up to the Water Temple is actually pretty good, as it utilizes a lot of water-based mechanics and of course the Zora armor. But then the entire temple itself drops nearly all of the water-based puzzle design it had, completely giving up its potential. And the boss is pitiful yet annoying. It's a little gremlin who shoots sludge and then turns into a big sludge shark. His moveset is weak, and you once again struggle only because you have to find Zora bro and press A on him. And then the last temple, the Thunder Temple. It's the second best behind Wind, but that isn't saying much. It feels extremely cramped, and the verticality doesn't really lead well into the overall dungeon design. The puzzles are light-based, which is fine, I don't really mind them. But easily the biggest pitfall of the dungeon is the boss. A genuinely annoying and frustrating fight that feels fairly inconsistent. It once again falls into the major issue of needing to press A on someone. But in general, the fight having so many adds while also dealing with clicking on a homie and then having to do it again while the boss tries to fuck with you and your party is nothing but annoyance after annoyance. It still manages to be better than the next temple though. The Spirit Temple is just depressing. The goal is to put together the body of the 5th Sage, which is basically just making a Gundam figure, and that is fun, except that is all just the lead up to the dungeon. The dungeon itself is a single room where you box another Gundam on top of your Gundam? It's easy, and it's sad. Moving on. Oh, wait, that's all of them? Well, what the hell? The dungeons go from passable to downright awful. What happened here? It feels like they still haven't figured out how the dungeons work from older Zelda titles because these aren't cutting it. Also, last little side note is just that the shrines are overall better in this outing. The puzzles are more diverse, the Eventide Island shrines are genuinely awesome, and the shrines that teach base mechanics taught in the GSI are genuinely stupid. And you know what? I think it's about time we talk about the combat. Combat in Tears of the Kingdom is basically completely unchanged from Breath of the Wild, aside from a couple of unique changes based around the arm abilities of the game. For one, the bombs were replaced with bomb flowers. They act like regular Zelda bombs when thrown, and then can also be attached to arrows to create impromptu bomb arrows. In fact, that is probably the greatest change when it comes to Tears, the complete scrapping of different types of arrows. All you have is base arrows, and then you just fuse different materials to the end to create the different types from scratch. It makes it much easier to balance arrow types when you don't have to actually balance the arrows themselves. The main downside to this material throwing and fusing system is the fact that the menu is a giant horizontal scroll. It takes absolutely forever to find what you want, but luckily, if you want to keep using that material, it does save the placement in the menu. But beyond that hiccup, the system itself actually brings a greater sense of purpose to all the random crap you end up picking up around Hyrule. And the best part is that a lot of the stuff you fuse together has many different unique interactions with each other. And these new kinds of interactions extend into weapons as well. There are 3 different weapon types, but they also have a hidden sharpness value and strength value. You can increase the sharpness and or strength based on what you fuse to the end of a weapon. A regular rock on the end of a stick will give it the strength of a hammer. A tooth on the end of a stick will give it the sharpness of a knife. These attributes affect their usability on enemies and the environment, which is extremely cool. You can also use either materials you have or other weapons to create new weapons with higher damage and or better attributes for whatever scenario you find yourself in. So yeah, fuse cool, but what about other new combat ideas? Well, there really aren't any. Fuse is extremely cool, don't get me wrong, and it does change the combat in a severe and unique way that I ultimately think is way better than Breath, but there isn't anything else. You still spam perfect parries and flurry rushes to win the day every single time. However, there is still one more change they made, and that was to the champion abilities. Champion abilities, for those who don't know, are the Daruk's Protections of the world or the Rivali's Gales of the skies. They were time-based abilities that were extremely overpowered for most, but also extremely rare to use since they had very long cooldowns. Mipha's Grace is a revive with a cooldown of 24 minutes. Rivali's Gale created an updraft with a cooldown of 6 minutes. Daruk's Protection blocked any damage with a cooldown of 18 minutes. And lastly, Arbrosa's Fury, which unleashed an AoE lightning strike with a cooldown of 12 minutes. These cooldowns ultimately made these abilities less utilized in general, even though they were extremely powerful. In an attempt to balance these abilities, but also make them more usable, we were given Sage abilities in Tears of the Kingdom. Sage abilities are a great solution to the champion abilities, as they give scaled back but more usable abilities in the long term. You have Tulin's Gust of Wind, which pushes you forward a good portion in the air, Yonobo's somewhat useless cannonball technique, Sidon's Water Shield //, Riju's Aimed Lightning Strike, and finally, Minoru's Mech. Outside of the mech, which I will get into with the next section, the Sage abilities are quick to use and quick to reuse. They aren't super powerful, but they still help enough where you will end up seeking them out when in need. But of course, they had to mess it up. The only way to activate these abilities is by walking over to the person and clicking A on them. They move around constantly during battle, so it becomes a pain in the ass when you want another hit on your favorite Zora's water shield. I feel like it could have been so much easier had their abilities been mapped to a select wheel, not unlike the arm ability menu. Or if that didn't work, perhaps a shortcut-based menu where you hold ZL then press the face button like A or B, and each button corresponded to a specific sage. Whatever it is, the system in place didn't cut it, and ultimately made the inclusion of the abilities feel more frustrating and patronizing than actually usable. Again, I like the concept, but the execution is terrible. And another terribly executed concept has got to be the nuts and bolts style build your own machine system, aka Zonai parts. As I have mentioned more than a few times, Tears of the Kingdom introduces the ability of Ultra Hand, where you can build machines and vehicles and whatnot in a very similar style to Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Something to note about Nuts and Bolts, however, is the game is very much structured and designed with an insane man at the blueprint. That is simply not the case here, and I don't mean that in a good way. This system is fun, I think that much is obvious. However, it is brought down by the battery and Zonai parts. I already explained why the battery is flawed, but the Zonai parts are also messed up. They have a set limit on use before they expire, or at the very least quite a few of them do. While the parts themselves are fun and unique, they ultimately feel very forced in and not well meshed with the design of the open world. You build cars and airplanes and all these amazing vehicles, sure, but the design of each part is extremely limited in nature. A fan, a wing, a flame blower, a rocket, a joystick, a wheel, a battery. All of these function in obvious and simple ways and are of course all powered by the same damn battery. And as I said, you never upgrade the battery, which leads to all of these fancy creations you use being useless. They run for maybe 10 seconds, and then you find out that it's better to either use the paraglider or ride a horse. They do what Zonai parts do, but better. Anything they can do, other things do better. And really, that's my main point here. The inclusion of the ability to build is neat, but it isn't useful. Contrast Ultra Hand to the simple abilities of Breath of the Wild: Magnesis, Cryonis, and Stasis. Magnesis is the closest thing to Ultra Hand in Breath, and it can only move specific kinds of objects around. This means a lot of scenarios in the game were crafted with this limited toolset in mind. You couldn't just run in with a giant car or shoot enemies from your plane. These encounters were made so you would engage with the core mechanics of Breath. These encounters mean nothing in Tears because you can do nearly anything. The game is simply not prepared for this level of interactivity and ideas. Call it a power fantasy, but I think it just ruins the game's structure and design and world and everything. Breath of the Wild had problems, don't get me wrong. The paraglider is a genuine curse, which continues to plague Tears of the Kingdom in even worse ways. And with the DLC, you could summon a horse to any location in the entire game, which made actually walking around completely unnecessary. But giving the player the ability to create things that only enhance the issues already present isn't innovative, it's stupid. Whether you had infinite battery or barely any, their inclusion is a genuine mistake. If they wanted to make a nuts and bolts, they should have committed to it like Banjo did. Tears of the Kingdom is extremely flawed. No matter how far I got in the game, I was always subconsciously thinking that Breath was better. And after completing the game, I can say confidently, I was right. The game is good, it really is. But unlike what everyone seems to believe, it is no masterpiece. Before I wrap this thing up, I want to riff off some stuff I forgot to talk about, such as performance issues, so let's do that now. It's rough. Some areas are consistently terrible to play through, and Ultra Hand makes the game a stuttery, awful mess. However, it should be telling that most, if not all people you talk to about the game still find it incredibly fun, regardless of issues. I just hope that the next Nintendo console has this game as a launch title to make up for the bad performance here. At one point I mentioned that Tears forces you to do the temples before fighting Ganondorf. Well, it turns out I was wrong. You can go fight Ganondorf immediately. But despite that, I still think my criticism stands up, as the game doesn't make it clear that you can until after you have already done everything. It feels like the idea here was to give players a reason to play the game again for a challenge playthrough after they realized they could immediately fight Ganondorf, sorry. And honestly, if that's true, then I think they made a major mistake. You can use Zonai charges to make the battery on Zonai devices last a whole lot longer than the base battery life. I didn't know this because I never consumed one out of fear that I would need one for upgrades. So I don't think this ruins my critique of the system, but it might for you. That's up to you to decide. I couldn't really fit it in anywhere, but the Ganondorf fight is genuinely awesome, and if more boss fights or simply regular mobs acted in a similar vein, that would have been awesome, and definitely changed my opinion on the combat a bit. And if I missed something else, then that most likely means that it was just fine or even great, such as the music. I really think they did a great job, even if there are a bunch of reused tracks and motifs. And if I really needed to address something, then I guess it'll have to wait till the DLC releases. Spoilers for that future video, if it's Master Mode, I will run it through the mud. Thanks for watching this review, as it took a lot of time to make. If you want to see more of my stuff in the future, then please subscribe. If you want to watch me play through games like this and others in the future for videos, then you can follow me on Twitch, link in the description. And finally, if you want to support me in my effort to make high quality video essay content, then you can chuck a few bucks my way on Patreon, link in the description, alongside Nyx, Hero, and Ari Boros. Sayonara, losers!